Nothing like a break away from it all. No video essays, no pestering hedgehogs. Just sitting here and letting my ceramic bake in the blistering summer heat.
Rise and shine, Mr. Pyro.
Who are you?
Neil Moen, the new CEO of YouTube. In other words, I'm your new boss.
Okay, cool. Well, I'm kinda on vacation at the moment, so if you could get back to me in a week, that'd be great.
That's not how this works. When you became monetized, you sold your soul over to YouTube LLC. And if you want to continue your peaceful existence, then you will make another video immediately or else suffer the flames of eternal irrelevance.
And I would, but I don't really have any good ideas at the moment. Kinda been suffering a bit of a burnout lately, you know what I mean?
Just make a video about how video games suck now. That's what you gamers are best at anyways.
You got a point. Tell you what, I'll do you one better. Just give me a sec. Hey there, Pyromaniacs. Nostalgia's a cruel mistress, isn't she? I feel like everyone has a specific period of time that they consider the peak of gaming, and that the industry just hasn't recovered since. You might think the 90s was the best time to be a gamer, with games like Doom and Sonic the Hedgehog and Chrono Trigger, or the 80s with Pac-Man and Super Mario Bros., or even the 70s, and if you're in that category, please remember to take your meds, Grandpa. Your grandkids still care about you. No matter who you are, though, there's always something in everyone's mind known as recency bias. This is a phenomenon where the mind tends to hold recent events in higher importance than others that happened further in the past. This means that there are always a lot of people that insist that the current era of gaming is the worst, which only enhances that feeling of nostalgia for days gone by. I've been thinking though, if we were to remove the nostalgia from the variables, what really was the best time in gaming? Like, if you broke everything down into specific factors and judged the wider gaming landscape on those factors, what would have been the objective best time to be a gamer? What would those variables be and how would you judge them? Well, I decided to give it my best shot and give my opinions on which eras in gaming are at the very least contenders for the absolute best states the industry has ever been in. I decided the easiest way to break the eras of gaming up was the same way that most people do, which is by separating them into their respective console generations. It's just an easy way to categorize this sort of thing, as the hardware of each console basically dictates what games are made and how, which leads to each generation having its own self-contained culture spanning several years, usually around 5 to 7 years depending on the generation. The factors I'm going to look at are what I think the most important for as many gamers as possible to thrive. These factors are variety, dev time, and quality. How many different types of games were coming out, how long did it take for them to come out, and when they did come out, what were the chances that they were going to be good? You could use these factors to make arguments for almost every generation if you wanted to, but I've managed to narrow it down to 3 different console generations that I'm sure nobody will write angry comments about. So before we get started, I just want to clarify that these are not just my opinions and are actually objective facts. So if you disagree, that means you're stupid. With that said, let's get on with it. My first choice for the best era in gaming is the 6th console generation, which ran from the years 1995 up to about 2005. But to explain why I hold the 6th generation in such high regard, I first have to explain the 5th generation and why it really wasn't as good as all those millennial game journalists make it seem. The 5th console generation was a transitionary period for the video game industry. As 3D graphics were becoming more viable on everyday hardware, this was obviously a very cool innovation that permanently changed the landscape of the industry. It's just a shame that most of the games that came out for that generation were flaming donkey butt. Once again, this was a transitional period, which means that everyone was still learning how to make 3D games, let alone how they should play. This led to a lot of franchises that were 2D in the last generation having some pretty rough transitions. Yep, despite what game journalists would have you believe, Sonic wasn't the only series to suffer in the jump to 3D. The downgrade between Earthworm Jim 2 and 3 will be studied by scholars for generations to come. Games looked considerably worse, played considerably worse, and sounded slightly better depending on which hardware you're talking about. At the time, people were just reveling in the technology, but looking back, it was a serious step down from what had come just a few years before. A lot of devs decided to hold off on making the full leap just yet and instead use the more advanced hardware to make higher fidelity 2D or isometric games. That's how we got games like Oddworld, Klonoa, Tomba, Digimon World 3. Although Konami decided to do both and give us both Castlevania 64 and Castlevania Symphony of the Night. Guess which game holds up more? All this isn't to say that there weren't good games in the 5th console generation. We had GoldenEye, Banjo-Kazooie, Crash Bandicoot, Spyro, but generally it was stuff like Bubsy 3D and Mary-Kate and Ashley Magical Mystery Mall. All the fumbles of the 5th console generation were necessary in the grand scheme of things. It was all just the growing pains of an ever-changing industry. And now that I've got all the 30 and 40-somethings mad at me, I can move on to explaining how the 6th console generation learned and evolved from its less stellar older sibling. Throughout the awkward phase of Gen 5, developers obviously learned what did and didn't work in 3D. So by the time the PS2, GameCube, and Xbox came out, most companies had gotten a better idea of what feels best in a 3D game. Not to mention the fact that the advancements in graphics and processing power means that not only do games no longer look like rejected Picasso paintings, they just generally play better too. There was a consistent rollout of new games in all genres during this time, and developers were constantly finding new ways to improve the mechanics of their next projects. These advancements led to the development of high-octane action games like Devil May Cry, 3D open-world games like Grand Theft Auto 3, and graphical powerhouses like Far Cry becoming a reality. The amount of games that came out during this time that we're still feeling the influence of to this very day are insurmountable. God of War came out this generation, a series that to this day hasn't let up. The Halo games single-handedly proved that first-person shooters not only can work on consoles, but can thrive on them too. And as previously stated, Grand Theft Auto finally made the jump to 3D, which basically put Rockstar on the map as an industry leader, with countless other games trying to copy its style, leading to the first big wave of open-world games. Not to mention, this was the first point in time where gaming started to bleed more and more into the mainstream. Video games were becoming a more widely accepted hobby for young adults. This led to networks like G4 popping up, and other networks like MTV greenlighting shows like Video Mods, which was basically Source Filmmaker before Source Filmmaker. Gaming wasn't just children's toys anymore. It was a subculture that drew in a lot of young adults in the early 2000s. A major contributor to this was the rise in online functionality in games during this time, with services like Xbox Live and SegaNet, and games like World of Warcraft and Halo 2 bringing gamers together in ways never seen before. When I think of gaming as a hobby to this day, I still associate it with the aesthetics of the early to mid 2000s because of just how significant this era was to the medium. Moving on to the second era that I consider one of the best, it's actually the very next one over in the 7th console generation, spanning from 2006 to 2013. While this generation wasn't nearly as groundbreaking as its predecessor, there were still some aspects to it that I think can genuinely make it a contender for the best time to be a gamer. With all the great advancements in 3D gaming in the 6th console generation, 2D gaming actually started to suffer considerably, as they were seen as cheaper and therefore harder to market while still making a profit. The 2D games that did come out for the 6th generation were usually either for the handhelds or just weren't very good. It just wasn't financially viable for companies to spend production and distribution costs for games that were, at their core, budget titles that inevitably weren't going to sell that many copies regardless. With the rise of the 7th console generation, we finally had a solution to this problem with the advent of digital distribution. Storefronts like Nintendo's WiiWare and Microsoft's Xbox Live Arcade allowed developers to release smaller budget games without the worry of physical production costs, meaning they could sell the games for cheaper too. And on Xbox, all these games had downloadable demos, so if players still weren't sure about a game, they could try it before they buy. We don't think about it much nowadays, but digital distribution really was a very literal game changer. Digital distribution also made it way easier for independent game developers to get their games seen by a wider audience. This was the generation that gave us such indie darlings as Dust and Elysian Tale, Cave Story, Splosion Man, and a little underground project you might not have heard of called Minecraft. This single advancement completely leveled the playing field for developers both big and small. Anyone with the right resources can now get their game out there and into the world and potentially become the next big thing. It really was the great equalizer for gaming. Digital distribution also led to the rise of downloadable content, colloquially known as DLC, a new way to support games with new content post-release. While DLC was technically already a thing in the 6th console generation on the Dreamcast, it wasn't widespread on every mainstream console until the 7th.
Holy cow! You mentioned the Dreamcast without making fun of it.
Yeah, don't rub it in. Before then, if you wanted to add more content to a game, you'd either release an expansion pack or you develop a sequel. That's really just the same game with a couple new bells and whistles. There were definitely companies that took advantage of this new way to sell stuff to players. Horse armor! And a lot of companies very obviously were just cutting out content from the official release to sell to players later, but generally the ability to continue to update and support games after the initial release was a major turning point for the whole industry, and I would still consider it a net positive. All of this isn't even mentioning the continued graphical improvements of the generation. While to this day I still think that there's some 6th gen games that still hold up, the 7th generation was the first time that games truly started looking closer to reality, with many games taking advantage of that heightened realism with more cinematic storytelling and immersive gameplay mechanics, to either feel like you're right there in the action, or in some cases taking control of some sort of playable movie. Games from the 7th console generation really just felt like the perfect balance of graphical fidelity and development time. Games were advanced enough to feel realistic and immersive without being so meticulously detailed that it takes forever to get a single game out. Because while I talked a lot on indies and budget titles, the AAAs from this generation weren't slacking either. BioShock, Mass Effect, Deus Ex Human Revolution, Uncharted. I could go on forever about the timeless classics to come out of this generation, but I think it's time for us to move on to my third and final contender for the best era in gaming. The final era I've considered might confuse and possibly even anger some people, understandably so. But hear me out, because I genuinely think that the 9th console generation, the one we're in right now, could potentially be the best it's ever been. Feel free to dislike the video now, I wouldn't blame you, because I completely understand why people would think that this is the worst it has ever been. Basically, all of the things that were great about the 7th generation have become banes of the industry. The DLC is no longer a great way to continue support of a game post-launch, and has instead become an excuse to nickel-and-dime players for cosmetics and content that would otherwise have been in the game to begin with. And post-launch updates and patches have become an excuse to release unfinished or just outright unplayable products at launch, with a hand-waving mentality of "we'll finish it later." The rise of online multiplayer has devolved to the point where every game is an always online live service that compensates for mediocre, grindy gameplay and uninteresting story with flashy visuals and loot with incrementally bigger numbers specifically designed to trigger a positive feedback loop in your brain to make you think that you're having more fun than you actually are, as a way to trick you into spending absurd amounts of money on a game that will inevitably be shut down in less than 2 years. Not to mention the hyper focus on every game being more graphically impressive than the last has reached its ultimate conclusion, where developers take so long to model, texture, and animate every single individual blade of grass that the average AAA game's development time has reached what 10 years ago would have been considered development hell. Don't get me wrong, there have been some fantastic games to come out of this generation. God of War Ragnarok, Elden Ring, Street Fighter 6, and Lies of P, a game right around the corner, looks amazing. But for every Tears of the Kingdom, there are 20 Redfalls and Gotham Knights. So with all that said, why in the world would I consider this generation to be one of the best? Well, it's quite simple. I've only been talking about the mainstream AAA market. Good, worthwhile AAA games become few and far between, the indie scene has been absolutely killing it. Over the years, game development software and digital storefronts have only become more and more accessible. Any talented creative can download an engine like Unreal or Unity and get to work on making their dreams a reality. While most AAA games have started to look and play exactly the same over the years, indie devs have continued to experiment and create fun new experiences for people to enjoy. You want a game where you play as a shape-shifting flying saucer traveling to alien worlds and slowly unraveling the mystery of a missing team of astronauts? XO1's got you. You want a procedurally generated open-world cyberpunk murder mystery RPG? Shadows of Doubt has got you. You want a 3D Sonic game that doesn't completely suck? Spark the Electric Jester 2 and 3 have got you. The more I dive into the modern indie market, the more I'm convinced that gaming has never been in a better place than it is right now. That experimental creative drive that made the 6th console generation so wonderful is alive and well in the indie scene, and I couldn't be happier. Plus, while every AAA game publisher is raising their prices to $70 or even $90 in some places, you can still get fantastic indie experiences for anywhere from $5 to $30 a pop. For example, The Forgotten City is a fully fledged open-world fantasy RPG in the vein of Elder Scrolls, and it only costs $25. Sure, it's nowhere near the size of an Elder Scrolls game, but the point still stands that you can get a very similar experience for the fraction of the cost. If you're feeling as jaded as many others when it comes to the modern gaming landscape, I highly recommend looking into the indie scene. I'm not exaggerating when I say you'll find exactly what you're looking for if you just take the time to look for it. There's no doubt in my mind that you'll eventually find that spark that'll make you fall in love with video games all over again. And with all that said, I still don't really know which one of these is the best. I'm inclined to say the 6th, as it was the time when AAA gaming was at its most exciting with groundbreaking advancements happening almost every day, but the 7th gave birth to so many games that many people to this day still consider to be some of the best ever made. Meanwhile, you have the 9th, which, with all the nice stuff I just said about it, I can't bring myself to give it to the 9th generation due to the poor performance of the mainstream market. I know it's a bit of a cop-out, but I'm gonna leave it up to you guys. Which of these generations, if any, do you guys believe to be the best time for gaming? Please make sure to tell me in the comments below. With that said, thanks for watching. If you liked this video—
What? You're not gonna give a conclusion?
well, no, it's a call to action, see. It's supposed to increase engagement.
Well, that's stupid.
Well, that's how the algorithm works, so maybe you should take it up with them.
Ah, noted.
Oh, I hope that doesn't come back to bite me.
My favorite generation is the 4th.
Hey, guess what?
What?
Nobody cares. Hey, the Pyromaniacs, thanks for watching. If you like this video, make sure to leave a like and become a Pyromaniac yourself by subscribing. Until next time, stay nerdy, my friends.